Prologue. Mountains, and Scotland's Munros in particular, defined my life for over 20 years. For those of you who don't already know it, and I'm guessing there might still be a few of you out there, a Munro is a Scottish mountain over 3,000 feet, or 914 metres, to use the less romantic metric standard. The obvious challenge for many aspiring weekend mountaineers like me is to complete them all, and so add our name to that growing list of Munros. As I write this prologue on a windy October night, I have 34 Munros outstanding. Some of them are easy ones, others are awkwardly placed leftovers from years gone by, and a few very hard ones are on the island of Skye, which I now think may be beyond me. I was 35 and well past my physical prime when I dragged myself up to the summit of my first Munro and discovered the pure joy of being there. Despite the late start, I reckon that by now I must have walked or scrambled my way to the summit of well over 500 mountains, and most of these have been Munros. I read about them. I commit their vital statistics to memory. I study their contour lines and unique geographical features. I talk about them endlessly, as my friends will most certainly testify. I write about them, and sometimes I even dream about them. The Munros have become my magnificent obsession. I have had 3 mountain partners. The first was Anna, and with her I very nearly completed all of Scotland's 282 Munros. But sadly our marriage withered with neglect, and then died quite suddenly on a winter's night, ending our partnership and a shared dream. I then walked the hills alone for a while, until a little Lhasa Apso I named Tashi came into my life. He turned out to be a mountain lion, and we had some great adventures together, and even invented our own list of hills. Little Yeshi Pixie was my next partner, and I tried to turn her into a hill dog, and at first it seemed like I might succeed. But then she discovered the beaches of Harris, and decided she preferred being a beach babe rather than a mountain girl. As I write these words, little Pixie is sleeping snugly by my side, dreaming, and this is my twa dogs' mountain tale. Chapter 1. The Other Side of the Hill. Ours was a mountain romance. We spent the 4 seasons of Tashi's life in the Scottish hills, and it was only there that you would see my beautiful little Apso at his best. Tashi was a quite magnificent mountain athlete in his prime, and an absolute joy to behold in the hills. They were his natural element. I can see him now bouncing across the purple heather like a little lion, or surging up the path like an express train, or prancing proudly by my side like a little shadow, and of course always looking up at me with those lovely, loyal, adoring eyes. He loved his life, and most of all he loved me, and of course I loved him back with all of my heart. You could tell so much about my little Tashi La just from observing that wonderful, expressive tail of his. He could communicate so much with it. I remember one day when he was just a pup. Tashi's tail was swishing away happily, and we encountered a mum with her little boy coming towards us in our home street in Glasgow. "What a happy little dog!" the toddler exclaimed with utter delight on seeing Tashi. And he was indeed. For most of his life that bushy, unruly tail would wag with the sheer joy of being. You could tell so much about Tashi just by watching that tail. The Apso is a proud little prince, and holds his tail in an erect curl across his back to keep it out of harm's way. Otherwise, it would drag along the ground. Tashi didn't like me combing his tail. He knew if he protested I would give up on the job quickly enough, and it was only after a trip to the groomers that the tail was ever perfectly coiffured. He detested the groomers too. Tash was not a pooch who wanted to be pampered or to be paraded with pedigree perfection in some canine beauty contest. He was just naturally a wee cutie, and he knew it. And boy, did he use his charms to play me and bend me to his will. Tashi was a master of manipulation. Generally, I have only the very vaguest recollections of people met in the mountains, as I assume our paths will probably not cross again, and more often than not, I don't even bother with the pleasantry of formal introductions. Douglas was an exception to this rule, but he is principally remembered for his imperious pomposity and a rather strange whooping laugh. Tashi, I have to say, took an immediate dislike to him, and left his calling card on his carelessly placed rucksack. We were all on Ben Hope, Scotland's most northerly Munro, and it was a near perfect day weather-wise. Douglas was alone, and quite obviously en route to another tick in his log. I merely afforded him an excuse for temporary respite from the upward toil, and the unexpected opportunity to preen and posture in the company of what he took to be an apparent inferior. At the time I was still very much a list ticker, and as is usual for confirmed baggers on such occasions, we ended up talking about the particular merits of various mountains, but neither of us chose to disclose our tally of ticks in that hallowed log. We were just about to part, when almost as an afterthought, Douglas asked if I'd heard anything about the new revisions to the Table of Munros. I remember the glint of satisfaction in his eyes when he realized that this was indeed news to me. He savoured that moment, allowing me to dwell on this sudden reversal, and as he held my eyes like a smiling, damned villain from a Victorian melodrama, behind his back, and quite unnoticed, Tashi lifted his leg and left his scent mark on my adversary's sack. A quite heinous doggy crime, which I wisely chose not to reveal to a now preening Douglas. Yes, it would seem that the OS has discovered a Munro that's really a Corbett. Well, there must be a new edition of the hallowed guide coming out, I offer cynically. Of course, the SMC haven't made it public knowledge yet. Still a few loose ends to tie up here and there, so I'm really not surprised you hadn't heard about it, Dave. My psychological humiliation was complete, and my education is concluded with a discernible smirk. Having secured this victory at the death, Douglas departed for the summit of Ben Hope, with a joyous spring in his step, and no doubt completely secure in the self-sustaining knowledge that his was the more magnificent obsession. I guess we must have been about halfway up Ben Hope. It's a perfect day, and my 2-year-old Apso is raring to chase after Douglas. This has no appeal for old Two Legs now. I do feel guilty about turning him around, though. Last month I went to Skye without Tashi, and once again I was humbled by the Coolin. I sense that I have reached a turning point in this crazy journey. Part of me no longer believes I can complete the Munros. Well, I've had it with lists. What's the point when the goalposts change every other year? I have several summits in my collection, which were Munros when I climbed them, and now they languish in comparative obscurity. At various times over the last decade, I might well have entertained the notion of completion as an objective, and admittedly, I can still find myself imagining what it would be like to arrive at that final summit cairn. I can easily picture the scene of my triumph, and hear the friendly banter of friends in my head. I even feel all the mixed emotions of the moment, a contented fulfillment, tinged by the uncertain sadness that often comes at the end of a journey. Then I always find myself wondering, would the reality be any different to the way I envisage it? And do I really want to find out? So I guess we're no climbing Ben Hope then, big yin. We'll leave it for another day, Tashi. It's too hot, and I didn't get any sleep last night, thanks to you, by the way. You ken fine well I don't like tents. I have become a reluctant Munro bagger. Part of me wants to complete the Munros, but another part of me is content with simply being there in the mountains and enjoying the power of the now with my little dog Tashi. Having him in my life has seen the unexpected return of my dormant yellow streak, not so much out of any concern for my own physical well-being. Nobody lives forever, and as the Sherpas say, it's better to live one day as a tiger than spend a lifetime as a sheep, even a psychedelic one like me. Tashi is my responsibility, and he would not fare well without me in his life. I will not go to the mountains without him again. Oh, I hear you bottled out on the end pin again, big yin. And don't try blaming that one on me, because I wasn't there. No, I was hame alone with your old boy and your old girl. All they do is sleep, eat and watch the telly. Hope you don't end up like that mountain boy. Well, it won't happen again. I've decided to stop bagging Munros. I'd rather be in the hills with you, Tashi. Hang on a minute. I'm no on board with these executive decisions of yours, mountain boy. What about me? I'm no ready to keep up bagging Munros. You won't have to. Plenty of easy ones we can do again to get your tick in that log, Tashi. That's okay then. So exactly how many have you done? I'll tell you that when you catch up, Tashi.
Chapter 2. A Wee Fairy Hill with Tashi.
The alarm activates at 6:30, and immediately I know the planned Corbett in Glencoe will regrettably not be happening today. As I do most of my walking these days with Tashi, my 18-month-old Lhasa Apso, I know that this spontaneous decision, born of my returning tendency towards sloth, will create no debate or recrimination with him. I suppose that this is one of the advantages of walking with my new best friend. He cares little about what we climb, and Tashi certainly won't give me a hard time about stealing an extra hour in bed. He will be looking forward to a walk, absolutely no doubt about that, so I'll have to come up with an alternative. Tashi is still to bag Ben Vane and Ben Vorlich on Lomonside, but I've done Ben Vane on numerous occasions, and Vorlich is, well, let's just say it's not a favourite hill of mine. Now, I suppose we could do its cousin at Lough Erne, but that's a popular hill with very restricted parking, and we will be running late. Come to think of it, I can't be bothered doing a Munro at all. A nice wee amble up a lesser hill will satisfy me today, and Tashi will have no opinion either way. Finally, inspiration comes to me at last. We can do Ben Antecedent in Strathfire. The fairy hill only reaches a modest elevation of 572 metres, but it gives great views, and will be new territory for Tashi. Best of all, it's a short route, and as far as I can remember, we will encounter no sheep. The drive up to Strathfire is enjoyable, I take the back roads, and we arrive at the car park next to the village shop and post office at 20 to 11. Tashi is always a nightmare in car parks, and tends to bark like a demented dingo until I let him out. A leisurely start to the day is not an option with him. "We're here, so let's get going as fast as possible," are the only thoughts in this little mountain dog's head, and he isn't willing to entertain or indeed indulge his aspiring pack leader. From the car park, we briefly follow a track alongside the river Balvague, and on reaching a minor road we turn left and cross the river by an old humpback bridge. We continue up this road for a few hundred metres until we meet another road that runs parallel to the forest. Here we turn left and see the Forestry Commission sign marking the start of the route. This sign refers to our hill as Ben Sheehan. The route through the forest is waymarked, and should you choose to utilise it, we are following the blue route. Now, I have more difficulty following waymarked routes than I do navigating with map and compass in a whiteout, so I always shun them. I briefly debate whether to take a picture of the start point, but this is always a tricky manoeuvre. The camera is currently stowed in my sack, and Tashi will immediately pounce upon a grounded rucksack, as he views it as a potential source of food. When we are clear of the road, Tashi is released from his lead, and I am immediately dismayed to see that the little dude is intent on making the summit in record time, and he is soon hurtling off up the path. The ascent through the forest is steep in places, but the path is good and makes for swift progress. Tashi has yet to fall into line with my preference for a gentle upward plod, and this is one of the few disadvantages I have discovered from hill walking with a dog, and particularly one as fit as mine. There is absolutely no way of communicating the concept of going too fast to man's best friend, and in no time at all we have caught up with an elderly walking group. Now, Tashi's a very cute little guy, but the Apso can be feisty by nature, and they can be, well, quite objectionable with strangers. In Tibet they are used as guard dogs in the temples, and revered as a sacred reincarnation of lions or even monks. If Tashi doesn't like the look of you, he will definitely go into demented dingo mode. Luckily, he seems to be more intent on overtaking the elderly ramblers as quickly as possible, and Tashi even indulges their oohs and ahs. Having passed the oldies, Tashi continues to forge on ahead, and only stops to regard me with his Apso disdain, and also to make sure that I'm actually still following in his exuberant wake. As forests go, this is a particularly open affair, and it is almost Tolkien-esque in the light today, and the mixture of greens, golds, and reds are particularly impressive, and of absolutely no interest to Tashi. He is still galloping ahead of me, and those powerful little lungs of his or pounding paws are going like the proverbial clappers. After about 40 minutes we emerge from the trees onto the open hillside of the little mountain's southeast ridge. The views are particularly impressive from this point, with the Munros of Ben Vorlich and Stucha Crone already accumulating their wintry snow. I make a stop to take some pictures, and Tashi dives head first into my rucksack in a frantic search for food. The view up the length of Loch Lubnaig is beautiful, with tendrils of wispy mist creeping up and along the ridges of Ben Ledi and its near neighbour Ben Vane. Tashi hurtles off again, and is alarmingly soon out of sight. Moments later I see him pop up. He's come back looking for me, and once again I get that now familiar look of Apso disdain. He is such a show-off, my little Tashi. In no time at all we are upon the first of the mountain's 3 summits. Tashi, of course, tops out well before me, and he seems particularly pleased with himself today. and is rolling about on his back when I eventually join him on the summit. While I take more pictures, he gorges himself on smacko beef bones, and then we head off towards the main summit. A small fence has to be negotiated en route, and this temporarily holds Tashi in check, as it's just too big for him to jump. With so much rain up here in the last week, the ground is heavy and waterlogged, but this does little to slow Tashi's progress, and in no time he is halfway to the main summit. Suddenly, the sound of dogs barking down below in Glen Bucky attracts his attention, and he veers off to the left and starts heading down to join them. This will be a good test of his recall. I call his name, but the downward gallop continues. I call him again, but louder this time, and with a degree more urgency in my tone. That makes him stop in his tracks, and he looks up at me, wondering, no doubt, what my problem is. I call for a third time, and my little guy bounces upwards through the heather like a little goat. As a matter of interest, Apso probably derives from the Tibetan word rapso, which refers to a small hairy mountain goat. When Tashi arrives back at my side, I neglect to praise him for his dutiful return, and maybe that's why he makes 2 further attempts to make an unplanned descent to Glen Bucky on curiosity grounds. On the third of these attempts, he actually disappears from sight, and my calls seem to be falling on deaf ears, and I am beginning to think that I will have to descend after him. Eventually my bawling succeeds in attracting his attention, and I am relieved to see his familiar hairy black frame bouncing towards me at full gallop. Of course, I am careful to lavish him with praise this time. From the summit we can see the impressive snow-capped mountains of the Lawyers Range and the Crianlarich Munros. From here it's possible to extend the route by descending to Glen Bucky, as Tashi has already endeavoured to demonstrate. From there you can follow tracks and old roads back to our start point in Strathire, but I reckon there will be sheep down there, and I decide not to put this temptation in Tashi's way. I bribe my little Apso with a bit of gammon roll, and sneakily slip his lead on, to prevent any further attempts to join the dogs and sheep in the glen below. After a final pause to soak in the view, we retrace our steps, and by 10 to 2 we are back at the car.
Well, this is the life, mountain boy. A nice comfy back seat just to myself. Shame you have to do all the driving, though. Big un, is it not about time you got around to driving us home? I'm a bit on the pecky side here, and I know you got prime beefsteak stowed away in that cold thing that makes a weird noise, and yours truly is having some of that prime steak when we get back to my den. Aye, it's a dog's life, all right.